Wow, what a week. React taint, me getting cancelled because I'm wrong and my opinion is bad, Vercel releasing their own font, and most importantly, there we go, Next.js 14 finally released. There's three main new features that Next.js brings, and one of them has been the reason for a lot of debate and a lot of people making fun of this new release. The first change is very simple. It just makes Next.js 14 much faster, about 50% for the local startup server time and about 94% for hot module replacements, which is huge. However, before you get too excited, not all tests on this are passing yet, so the feature is not yet stable. It will be stable once 100% of tests are passing. However, only 90% about are currently passing, so it's not stable just yet. Second one, partial pre-rendering. What this allows you to do is to define a static HTML shell that is immediately served when the request comes in, then all the dynamic content that you can wrap in a suspense component is streamed in later. Pretty straightforward, but a nice change nonetheless. And then comes the third change, and those are server actions. They're now marked as stable, and they have been the reason for a lot of discussion. This image right here has been going super viral in the web dev space and beyond, and there were so many people clowning about just this image on Twitter, on Reddit, basically everywhere. People have been making fun of this big part of the Next.js 14 release, and the reason is mainly twofold. First off, it really reminds people the syntax that is used here, the server action, of the old PHP days. And then secondly, way more importantly, security concerns. Isn't the code right here that's shown extremely vulnerable to SQL injection attacks? Well, to find out, let's take a look at the exact code that is used on the slide. It's this bookmark component right here. It takes in a slug as a string and uses that slug property it takes in something called a server action inside of this button called form action. This function actually runs on the server and uses the slug inside of an SQL insert statement. And this is the problematic line. This is where many people believe this is unsafe. This is where an SQL injection could happen. So if everyone is right and anyone found out that this vulnerability is in your app would be ruined in seconds. The really important question therefore is, are they right? Is this an SQL vulnerability? Let's take a look at how an SQL injection attack works to find out. Assume we have a user ID that is passed as the query parameters, for example, or any other field that the user has access to that they can change, like the URL, for example. Let's save it as a constant and use it inside of an SQL select statement. This right here is horrible. This is a SQL injection vulnerability, because let's assume that the user changes the user ID that they can in the URL to something like this, a drop table users command in a specific syntax with a double dash at the end to comment out everything that comes behind it to avoid potential syntax errors. What that would mean is our user ID suddenly becomes this statement, which is an actual valid SQL command, and for all our database knows, in this case it's pretty stupid, it turns this into two actual commands. The first one, a select statement that doesn't do anything really, and then the second one that deletes your entire database. This right here is an SQL injection. But then what would a safe approach look like? After all, dynamic insertions are super important. You can't hard code everything. And this is the answer. At the top, we have the unsafe vulnerability from before. At the bottom, we have a parameterized query. What that means is the user ID is now passed in as a proper sanitized parameter where the $1 stands instead of being interpolated like in the first example. Now, you might be wondering, Josh, if the first one is unsafe and the second one is safe, then why is the guy in the presentation from Next.js Conf not using either of these approaches, neither the unsafe nor the safe, but an SQL statement that is never invoked actually, but has instead template strings? What's the difference? Is this safe? To understand if it is, let's take a look at how to even invoke a function using template strings, because the usual way we are all used to is to invoke a function like this, with parentheses passing the arguments or parameters, I always mix those up, inside of there, receiving them in the function and doing something with them. For example, the name of John that is processed in the greet function and that we can then log out. What we expect to happen, of course, is to see hello John in the console. Let's save it, and of course that is exactly what happens. So what's about the template strings? And that's exactly what's known as a tag function. Let me show you what that means. For example, let's turn this greet into a tag function, receiving strings as the first parameter of type template strings array, which is a built-in TypeScript type. We don't need to import that. Let's zoom out just a tad so everything fits on the screen. And then we have a name as the second one, just like before, as the second parameter. Now we can see there's a syntax error. Expected 2 arguments but got 1. So what happened is, just because we inserted this strings as a template strings array, we turned this into a tag function that we can now invoke using template strings. Now the error will still be the same, but if we pass something like first, second, and then the actual interpolated value, like the name on top, for example, the syntax error is all of a sudden gone. We just invoked a function using template strings. So what exactly just happened? Why is the syntax error gone? So let me show you what this does. Let's log out the strings right here. Let's get rid of this console log and see what happens. If we save this, we get back an array. This array, as the first argument, has first, second. So whatever comes before the interpolated value, then comes the interpolated value. And that is actually not part of the strings. The strings are everything that is not dynamic where we invoke the function. The name is. And by the way, the argument doesn't have to correspond to the parameter name. I could call this anything I wanted. The important thing is that this is the first thing that is interpolated. Therefore, it will be passed as the first thing besides the strings into this function. So if we logged out anything, we expect it to be John right here, because that is the first interpolation wherever we invoke this function. So the important thing to take away from this is that if we invoke this function using template strings, we can actually safely accept these arguments and pass them into a parameterized or however that's called function that I told you about earlier, the safe second variant I told you about. Whereas if we invoke the SQL command directly, it would be really, really bad. So yes, it's true, Vercel would not let anyone on the stage that presents super insecure code, because this code example is perfectly fine. It uses template strings. These are then put into a parameterized query, whatever that's called, which is sanitized, which is totally cool to do. So all the people doubting this implementation don't really understand how SQL injections work. It's kind of unfortunate that people have been clowning on this one image so much, but it is what it is. I'm really happy with the release and I would love to hear what you think about it. That's it for me for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and I'm gonna see you in the next one. Have a good one and bye bye.